Welcome to Chapter 5. In this chapter, I'll be talking about the relationship between organisms and temperature. If you remember, the definition of ecology is the relationship of organisms with each other and with their environment. And we're looking at various aspects of environment as we go through these chapters, and this time we're focusing on temperature. This is something that students at Wisconsin Lutheran College, along with myself, are actually looking at in our studies of the coral reef in the Grenada nearshore waters. There, we're evaluating the extent of bleaching on the coral, and bleaching is a response of coral to increases in water temperature. When the water temperature gets over a certain threshold, it's right around 83 degrees Fahrenheit, then the single-cell algae called zooxanthellae that live inside the coral polyps leave the coral polyps, and that's where coral gets its color, and so they become transparent, and you can see the white skeleton underneath, and so it looks like the coral has been bleached. This can eventually lead to the death of coral, so it's caused quite a serious problem as water temperatures have risen in the Caribbean. There was a very large episode of bleaching in 2005 across the Caribbean, and there was another incident in 2010 that wasn't quite as extensive but still caused some bleaching on some of the coral reefs. So students at WLC are actually looking at coral in the nearshore waters of Grenada in order to determine the extent of bleaching. During this chapter, I'll be talking about microclimates, which are just small areas where the climate might be different, for example, on top of a rock versus under a rock in terms of temperature. And then we'll look a bit at temperatures in water, and then talk about the idea that organisms have an energy budget and they allocate certain amount of their energy to regulating temperature, or they perhaps allocate energy to live in a particular environment. And we'll study that principle of allocation, and then look at the performance of animals at different temperatures, and then look at plants for a bit and understand that plants do photosynthesis best at certain temperatures. High temperatures tend to cause a reduction in photosynthesis. And then we'll talk about microbes and get a feel for how microbes have adapted to different temperatures. For example, the microbes that live inside of our bodies are best suited for living in a temperature of 98.6. Yet there are some microbes that live in very, very cold climates, and some that are living in very hot environments. One of the important concepts that we'll get out of this chapter is that animals are always trying to balance the heat gain versus heat loss in order to survive at a temperature where they can use their energy or use their food most effectively. And so they have a variety of mechanisms to regulate their body temperature, and it allows them in many cases to survive in extreme environments like the desert, or some organisms that live right under the ice in Antarctica. And think of the March of the Penguins movie, where the emperor penguin is uh, hatching its eggs in an unbelievably extreme environment. I'll start out by talking about microclimates. Remember, back in Chapter 1, we talked about the importance of ecologists understanding the scale of their studies, and so this really relates back to that, where a macroclimate study would be a study of the weather patterns, the major weather patterns in an area, whereas if you're looking at the impact of microclimate, you may be looking at, as I mentioned right at the beginning of this lecture, the difference in temperature or maybe even humidity on top of a rock versus under a rock. So the microclimates can be very small areas. As we consider microclimates, one of the aspects of that is altitude, moving up a mountain. Again, we talked about this in one of the introductory chapters, where the climate can be very different at the base of a mountain than halfway up, and that's very different than what it is near the top of the mountain. So as we move up in altitude, there's generally a drop in temperature, and the organisms that live in that environment are going to reflect that change in temperature. It's also important to consider the direction that a particular structure is facing, and we can use our homes as an example of that. If you have a south-facing window in your home and you're living in these northern climates, like here in the Milwaukee area, you'll tend to get more sun shining into that window than if you had a north-facing window. And that tends to heat up that room more than the room on the north side of the house. And that's what we mean by aspect. So if there's a side of a hill that's facing, say, southeast, it will tend to be warmer than a side of the hill that's facing to the north. And the vegetation will reflect that difference. Now, there's also a difference in the amount of heat that's absorbed in a particular area depending on the color. So if you have a black sand beach, it will certainly be a lot hotter than a white sand beach would be. And if there's an area covered with vegetation, that tends to be cooler than a grassy field or just an area that has sand or dirt covering it. A good example of this would be taking a walk into the woods in the summertime. You can notice as much as a 10-degree drop in temperature when you get into the woods, and then when you walk back out into an open field area, you feel that temperature go back up dramatically. And so the organisms that tend to live in the forest are perhaps trying to avoid that warmer temperature and surviving more effectively in the forest as a result of the cooler temperature. Animals that live in water have a much more stable thermal environment than animals that live in the air, and that's because water absorbs a lot of heat before it actually changes temperature. It takes about 3,000 times more calories to change the temperature in water than in the air. And another really excellent benefit of water with regard to temperature is that when it changes into a vapor, it takes a lot of heat out of the environment. And so as we sweat and then that sweat evaporates from our skin, just 1 gram of that is taking up about 580 calories of heat from the environment around us, so it cools us down. And same thing happens to lakes and streams. When water evaporates from them, it tends to cool the water down so that the temperature environment there, the thermal environment, is much more stable. And then when water freezes, it actually gives off some heat. 80 calories is given off when 1 gram of water freezes. And so this slows down the freezing process in lakes and adds more stability to the system. It's interesting to look at the microclimate of a stream environment and look at the differences that we see there. You can see from the diagram here that daily variation in air temperature is much greater than the variation that occurs in the stream itself. But even within the stream, there is quite a difference. Certainly, one aspect is that those areas that are shaded often have a bit lower temperature than those that are not shaded. But the sections like the deep pool where the water moves more slowly and there's just more water in those sections, that has less variation than those areas that are more exposed, like the shallow riffle environment, where there is quite a bit more variation in temperature there. So the organisms that live in these different environments are going to use them based on their ability to withstand that variation in temperature. It's also interesting to note that during the winter time, the fish will tend to move to the large deep pool areas where it doesn't get quite as cold, and they'll spend the winter time there. Next, we shift gears to information about budgets. The principle of allocation says that there's a limited amount of energy available to organisms, so that if they use energy on a particular function, then there's less energy for another function. So if they are using energy in order to produce heat, in order to survive in a cold environment, then there's less energy available for them to chase down food or to search for food. Based on this budgeting idea, Levins came to the conclusion that if an organism has spent energy to adapt to a particular environment, then its fitness in other environments is going to be reduced. And it took the experiment with the bacteria E. coli by Bennett and Lenski to prove that this was actually the case for some organisms. This is often the way it works in ecology. Somebody will develop a hypothesis or a proposal or a theory, and then others will go out and do experiments either in nature or in the lab in order to see if that theory is actually true. It may make sense on paper, but is it actually something that's occurring in nature? And this is what Bennett and Lenski did with the bacteria E. coli. You could then take a study like this and apply it more broadly and say that in our situation where we're looking at global warming, organisms that are facing abrupt climate change are going to be less suited to survive if they've had a lot of years of adaptation in a very small temperature range, for example. So if the temperature changes quickly, maybe they won't be able to handle that and they'll go extinct. So why do animals perform more effectively in a particular temperature range? This really relates to the speed at which chemical reactions occur in their body. The breakdown of food, for example, is a chemical reaction in our bodies, and the speed at which that happens has to do with the function of enzymes. So enzymes work most effectively in a very specific temperature range where they're not too rigid in terms of catalyzing a reaction, but they're not so warm that they're actually breaking down and unable to catalyze the reaction at all. So if the temperature goes higher, then uh, the enzymes can stand and they change their shape, then they're unable to catalyze the reaction. The study that Baldwin and Achachka did on rainbow trout was really interesting in that they were evaluating the ability of acetylcholinesterase to break down acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter, which is essential to carrying messages from one neuron to another. And this enzyme stopped working at, at different temperatures depending on what the fish had been acclimated to. And so this is a perfect example of an enzymatic reaction that has become adapted to a particular temperature range. And when you go out of that temperature range, it can cause death because now the neurons can't transmit their messages anymore. Enzymes are used by plants in the process of photosynthesis, and for those plants that are found in cooler environments, the photosynthesis process, the enzymes associated with that, are designed in order to provide the greatest amount of energy or sugar in the case of photosynthesis when the process is operating at those cooler temperatures. And if you compare that to a plant that's grown up, say, in the desert, the optimal photosynthesis temperature is much, much higher. And this is a result of a process of adaptation, which is different than the process of acclimation. In the process of acclimation, those enzymes which are involved in the process of photosynthesis function effectively at a wide range of temperatures, and the plant can acclimate to cooler temperatures, say in the spring, and then warmer temperatures in the summer, and then cooler temperatures again in the fall, and is able to survive a range of temperatures in that way. The temperature range that we're talking about when we talk about acclimation is much smaller than the temperature differences that we saw between the plants that were adapted to different environments, like the moss in the desert shrub. The take-home message from this section on plants, and also the section where we were discussing animals, is that there is an optimal temperature for the various enzymatic reactions that are occurring in these organisms, and that if we change the temperature where they live dramatically and in a short period of time, they will not be able to adapt to that and may not be able to survive in that new changed environment, even though they do have the ability to acclimate to small changes in temperature. It is interesting to note that simple organisms like bacteria that have the similar metabolic processes that more complex organisms have are found in a wide variety of temperatures. We call these bacteria extremophiles, and the two extremes are the psychrophilic bacteria that survive in an Arctic or Antarctic environment, very cold temperatures, and the thermophilic bacteria that live in very, very hot environments. You see from this graph that some of them are able to reproduce optimally at 4 degrees centigrade, while others are way up in the 60 plus degree centigrade temperature range for their optimal survival rate or reproduction rate. These extremophiles demonstrate the huge variability we see in nature in terms of the metabolic pathways that allow organisms to survive. In the next section, I'll be talking about how plants and animals regulate their body temperature. We really don't think of plants as regulating their body temperature, but they certainly do in the types of leaves that they have and their growth form. They're able to change the amount of heat that they absorb or give off. There are a couple of approaches to understanding this that you see in your reading in the book. The first one is a formula that gives you the various ways that heat is gained and lost in plants. So we start out with HS, heat stored in an organism or in a plant, and then we consider metabolism as providing a gain in heat, because as the organism or plant breaks down sugar or food, it gives off heat, and that heat then is a gain in heat to the body of the organism. And then we look at things like conduction, where heat can be transmitted from the surrounding environment or given off to the surrounding environment, and then convection, which is associated with the wind moving past the plant or the animal and carrying some of that heat away. And then we can look at radiation, where the heat is given off from an organism into the surrounding environment just by the movement of the atoms. And then we have evaporation as another mechanism for heat loss, and we talked about that previously, where when water evaporates, that absorbs a lot of heat. You can use either the formula or the diagram in order to understand the concept of heat gain and heat loss in plants and animals. The key thing is that you know these basic mechanisms associated with it. You certainly don't have to memorize the formula, but you need to know in what ways an animal or plant can gain and lose heat. As we go through the rest of this chapter, we'll be talking about poikilotherms, ectotherms, endotherms, and homeotherms, and these are different categories of organisms based on the way that they manage their body temperature. So the poikilotherms are simply reflecting the environmental temperature, whereas the ectotherms use external heat sources in order to maintain a fairly constant internal body temperature, and the endotherms depend on metabolic energy in order to maintain their internal body temperature, and the homeotherms really control their body temperature in a very narrow range. Desert plants provide a great example on how temperature can be regulated. If you think about the desert plants that you've seen, many of them look kind of fuzzy, and that's because of the little tiny leaves or little extensions on the leaves that reflect the sunlight so that they're not absorbing so much heat. And then the leaves are often very small, which allows the wind to kind of flow through the plant, and you get rid of some of that heat through convection heat loss. And then the plant often sits up off the ground so that there isn't the heat being conducted from the very warm sand or soil that the plant is sitting on. And so you have all of these things working together in order to prevent the heat from coming in, or to allow the heat to be given off more effectively. In Arctic plants, we see some of the opposite things going on so that these plants can stay warm. They're close to the ground, and their leaves are designed to absorb the heat more so that this heat of radiation is working for them. And they don't have the open kind of structure that the desert plants have. Switching over to animals now, we see for both the lizard and the grasshopper that they're able to manage their temperature from external sources so that their internal body temperature matches the temperature at which they can best metabolize or break down their food. And also in the case of the grasshoppers, their higher temperature reduces the number of pathogens that can live in their body. Next, we switch over to the endothermic animals and plants. And here we're talking about creatures who produce heat internally through the process of metabolism. And so the digestion of food gives off heat. As their muscles contract, there's heat given off. There's a variety of different ways that this heat can be produced internally. Some organisms are able to maintain their body temperature with very little change in their metabolic rate across a broad range of temperatures, and so they have a broad thermal neutral zone, while others maintain this in a very narrow breadth of temperatures, and then they need to start doing things in order to increase their internal body temperature. So when we look at this graph, we can see that the sloth and the monkey and the human and the marmoset have a very narrow range across which they're able to maintain their internal body temperature without raising their metabolic rate, whereas things like the polar bear and the Arctic fox have this much broader range in which they can not increase their metabolic rate and still maintain their internal body temperature. It's really interesting to look at the way that various animals maintain their internal body temperature. When we think of things like sharks and tuna and mackerel, we usually don't think of them as being endothermic animals, but they're constantly swimming throughout their lives, and their muscles are producing a lot of heat, and that heat is maintained within the body through these countercurrent heat exchangers. And here we see a diagram of that on the right, where the blood vessels are arranged right next to each other so that the heat is maintained inside the body, and the cold temperatures aren't carried in. So as the blood flows out to the extremities, the heat is by conduction moved over to the blood that is moving to the inner part of the body. And so this heat exchanger maintains the heat in the center core of the body. And the same type of thing is happening with the dolphin, which is a more typical endothermic animal, but has to maintain that internal body temperature in the very cold waters that it often lives in. The circulatory system is also important for maintaining the body temperature in some flying insects, like the bumblebees and the sphinx moth, where their body temperature is maintained by the warmth given off by their flight muscles, and then that heat then is distributed from the thorax to the abdomen. And in your book, you'll be reading about the experiments that demonstrated this process in these flying insects. The temperature regulation also occurs in a few plants, where the starchy material that's stored up in the roots is metabolized so that these plants, like the skunk cabbage, can produce a flower that will push up through the snow and actually melt some of the snow around it. And that way they can attract some of the first insects in the spring to their really bad smelling flowers and become pollinated before other plants have produced their flowers, and in this way they reduce competition. A fascinating area of study is how animals manage to survive through the winter through extreme environmental periods. And a book that I read recently called Winter World: The Ingenuity of Animal Survival by Bernd Henrich provided some fascinating examples of animals that, like the hummingbird, go into a state of torpor or reduced metabolic rate at night just so they can survive until their first meal in the morning, or animals that hibernate during the winter, but yet on a warm February morning they'll actually come out and look for food. And some call this estivation. Really, the difference between hibernation and estivation is not very clearly defined, but generally estivation is a shorter period of reduced metabolic rate. In any event, these animals have developed very unique ways to survive the cold winter months. So to review our chapter quickly, we have looked at how temperature changes over small areas, and that temperature in the water doesn't vary as much as it does on land. And we saw that the animals have a limited amount of energy, and what they allocate to managing their temperature then will not be able to be used for things like growth or reproduction. We saw that animals perform best at a certain temperature range, and it's the same thing with photosynthesis. We learned that microbes can live in a wide variety of temperatures. We talked about extremophiles, and that both animals and plants balance their heat intake against heat loss in order to maintain their body temperature.